everyone, welcome back to the Music Chat, and we'll be talking again today about the hymns that make Lent especially meaningful. And we have sort of a part two, it turns out, today with Ah Holy Jesus. It is, I'd have to almost say, a companion hymn to O Sacred Head, Now Wounded, that we talked about last week. We started to research this to find out about it, partly because we're using it during our own Lenten services so much. And it turns out it has a strikingly similar story.
It does.
To what we talked about last week. So if you feel like deja vu as we're talking, you are not imagining things.
Absolutely, it's absolutely
So, Barbara, take us back to, once again, the same place that O Sacred Head started from in the 11th century.
That's right, with the monks who, they really can kind of sort of trace the text back to, it is Jean de Fécamp.
Right.
Maybe. We're thinking.
Most probably.
Most
yeah.
probably.
Yeah.
And so there was a Latin text that he wrote, probably again because it was in meditation with his life. And then Johann Hermann, who was an Austrian, we think, Germanic anyway, person in the Lutheran, and he was a Lutheran pastor, who lived from 1585 to 1647. I think he was inspired by this Latin text.
Yeah, I understand he liked to study the works from what they call the Church Fathers, which are these Benedictine monks, especially from this part of France, I think. Augustine was one of them, that Bernard of Clairvaux that we mentioned last week. Some of those guys, and then de Camp was also in that area, that same area, with his ministry and writings and whatnot. And
so Johann was inspired by those writings and translated it into German, and took a bit of liberties with the text. So we're, I think inspired by the writing is the main thing to think about. Because he didn't just translate it, he was inspired and then wrote his own text. And it was put to some kind of a melody back then, and he published it, I think, in 1630.
He did.
And it again was about the crucifixion, but, and I don't know if it's too early to think about this or to mention it, but this was a meditation on our sin that caused the crucifixion, and that somberness of how could we have done this to you, Jesus.
Yeah, as compared to last week when we talked about O Sacred Head, and the verses of O Sacred Head focused on the crucifixion itself.
And the meditation on the crucifixion itself, exactly. And this is much more personal. This is, yeah.
This is more an exploration of who's responsible for the crucifixion on the cross. And
before we get more into that, let me just go back a little bit with Johann, because again, he was living as a pastor, a Lutheran pastor, during the 30 Years' War. And we think 30 years war, oh my goodness.
Like Gerhard.
Like Gerhard,
also,
right.
Yeah.
And he had many personal losses and tragedies. His mother actually, when he was born, said, if this child survives, I will make sure, praying to God, I will make sure that he becomes a pastor. Because she had lost so many children. And he did survive, although he was rather ill and sickly most of his life. And he went through many, many hardships.
Yeah, there was plague. Even before the war, there was
plague.
I know,
the plague.
For the years in the 1613, 1614, 15, that range of years before the war, there was fire in his city where he was living.
That's right.
he many times in that time period and then later in the 30 Years' War lost all of his possessions.
Yep.
You know, over and over again, you know, this kind of thing. And you just think, where does writing like this come from? And it's such a serious text,
Yes.
and a somber text, as you mentioned. And so where does it come from? It comes from a man who had nothing but his faith, you know,
Yes.
to try to reason through life. And it's pretty remarkable.
It's pretty remarkable,
Yeah.
And he is said to have been one of the most noted composers between Luther and Gerhard, actually. So he did have some notoriety there.
Right.
And his pieces are very have lasted and still mean a lot.
And he
to
also
everyone
was
today.
we've talked about this a few times, we've studied hymns and chatted about hymns that are a little bit later, you know, after the Reformation, that became more personal in,
Right.
in the type of writing style. And so he's considered sort of a transitional
Yes.
figure in coming from the objective text
Of the Reformation.
of the Reformation, and then transitioning into what we saw much in the 1800s, the use of the first person
Yes.
point of view as the text unfolds.
And I wrote down a few things just to kind of help our listeners understand what we mean by that. These hymns that are the more personal ones of the 17th century were distinguished by depth, tenderness of feeling, firm faith, deep love of Christ, humble submission to the will of God. Their somber, serious text is an admission of guilt on humanity's part, our part, in causing the crucifixion of Jesus. So as we talked, when I sing and hear O Sacred Head, it is a meditation for me on the tragedy of the crucifixion, the human part of the crucifixion.
Well, and imagining how Christ felt.
That's what I mean. How
as
that the
the
physical
human
part.
Christ on the cross enduring the pain.
Yes, and that puts it into a certain perspective for me. But this, the A Holy Jesus, is it is a crying out of, how could we have done this to you? How can we possibly repay you for this?
Yeah, so we'll come back to the tune, which we haven't really talked about, how we got the famous tune. But before we talk about the tune, we'll kind of finish up talking about the text and how the text came to us via translation. Obviously, Johann Heermann translated it from the Latin to the German. So now the German to the English, we have to go all the way to 1897 and tell us about the man who gave us the English translation.
Right, so he was Robert Bridges, and his dates were 1844 to 1930, so you know that turn of the century time. He was from Kent, England, classically educated. In fact, he was a physician who practiced medicine for quite a long time until he was unable to because of his health. But all along, I think he was also a poet. And he finally realized also that he could make a living with his writing. And he was very interested in those early German texts, and was able to take them and translate them. He published them in a Jottenden hymnal, which we had never really heard about.
No, that apparently was a pretty famous collection that's, you know, still has use today in terms of many of the hymns that came from that have gone on to be published and republished.
That was interesting. Yes. That was in 1899 that was published.
Right.
And it was, it had 100 hymns in it, and 44 were translated or written by him, and then mainly from the Genevan Psalter. But another thing that's kind of important with him is that he was declared the poet laureate for England in 1913. So this is a person
Yeah.
that was pretty well known for his literary success.
Yeah, he was as well known probably as Catherine Winkworth, who also translated this, by the way. She had her own translation, but our Lutheran hymn book actually uses his translation.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, from what I understand, when he went to translate it, translating from the German to the English was a little difficult to express the first line of trying to make tenderness out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Hard to do, you know, sometimes these translations, there's not an adequate word in the new
Right.
language.
Yeah.
And that may have happened to her mom from the Latin to the German as well. But he came up with "Ah, Holy Jesus" as a way to express, I think, just,
High esteem,
you know, like almost, yeah, just
awesomeness.
you know, just awe, you know, awe.
Right.
Not awe, but just kind of like a sigh, like,
I think
you know.
it's a sigh too.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, how could we have done this to you?
yeah, and because
That
the
kind of
next
thing.
line, "How hast thou offended?"
Uh-huh.
You know, what is it that you did to
Yeah.
deserve this?
Nothing. Yeah.
You know, and that we to judge thee have in hate pretended, by foes derided, by thine own rejected, O most afflicted. You know, and then the second verse, "Who was the guilty?" which is the key to the hymn, really.
Uh-huh.
You know, so then the subsequent verses really talk about our responsibility as humanity's responsibility and
Right.
the tragedy of the crucifixion
That's exactly right.
and the reason for the crucifixion.
Which needs to be uppermost in our mind all the time
Right.
at this season. Always, but
Which again,
especially this season.
it takes us a step even farther than "O Sacred Head,"
Yes.
which really only focus more on the cross, except it does also address how we respond in the end. You know, that, you know, we end up, what do we do with this grief and the weighed down feeling that we have of being partly responsible, and having a hand in judging Jesus in this way and throwing him onto the cross. And so our response is the fifth verse that we have. "Therefore, kind Jesus, since I cannot pay thee, I do adore thee, and will ever pray thee. Think on thy pity and thy love unswerving, not my deserving."
Right.
So we don't deserve the love, but we have it and we're grateful,
Mm-hmm.
and so we love him in response. So,
By living a life of gratitude for the redemption of God's love.
beautifully said. So we have to back up and talk about the tune a little bit. I mean, the star of this is the text.
Absolutely. Absolutely true. Mhm.
But a good tune never hurts.
Well, and the way Kruger said it, it has that weight and that depth as well. I mean, it's done very well.
Yeah, Kruger was Gerhardt's organist,
I
like we
know.
talked about last week, and he was just writing tunes to text. That was pretty much what he did. And so he wasn't the word meister, he was the tune provider.
Mhm.
And so he also was publishing with Gerhardt. They were working on hymnals, and so the hymn that was they took to fit Hermann's poetry was the tune that we know today. And it's interesting because I did find his manuscript of it. What is it? An old, I'm hoping Pastor Jeff will put it on the screen, because we've talked about this before too, just from a musicologist standpoint. You know, this has, oh dear, we have Kitty trying to sing the hymn over there. Oh dear.
We'll probably have to stop.
That's Simon the cat.
Simon the cat.
And he has a lot to say so far. But he he fades away though. It's usually a
Hopefully.
big crescendo act, so I think he's done now. But we have this 4-part hymn. This is just the first phrase, written in shaped notes, with the diamond is like a whole note, and then the diamond with the stem on it coming out of the center of the diamond are the half notes, and so the whole notes are longer than the half notes, and so you get that long, short, short, long, long kind of rhythm with it. And the C, A, T, B over to the left side, you know, alto, tenor, and bass are pretty easy to figure out, but why the C?
Melody.
Yeah, cantus means melody, so it's really like what we think of a soprano. So he had scored it, this is an open score arrangement that he had with the 4-part writing. And there's a later manuscript that I found that really basically is this shape note thing, written with our kind of notes, but it's also in a pretty early version of it. I'm not sure what hymn book it came from now. I think it may have come from, you know, this one would have been in Kruger's hymn book, but this would have been in something a little later, since it's written with the kind of manuscript we're used to seeing. But this harmonization is pretty familiar to us. Sounds like this. It's interesting at the end that it ends without a third. It's a very
Open.
Renaissance ending, you know, so he's definitely being still influenced by
Now,
earlier music.
would you play the Bach?
Yeah, and so we really still use what I consider very close to Kruger's original 4-part harmony, but you know, we were talking earlier before we started the chat about why music extends into centuries after centuries, and so something like this, it's valuable in its own right, but then someone like Bach or Brahms or whoever, you know, like great composers in certain eras will look back and find, you know, we think, you know, Bach would have been very familiar with this in his time period.
Absolutely.
He would have still had access, like O Sacred Head we talked about last week. Why did he harmonize O Sacred Heads? Because he had access. He knew these hymn books. He was a Lutheran himself.
And I'll come in again and say that that was the part of the Passion or the oratorio where it was the crowd speaking or the people, and it needed to be something familiar.
Right.
So.
Yep. And so you pick a hymn that's already known and you rearrange it and
fancy it up a little bit.
Yeah. And so we have his harmonization, I believe this was St. Matthew, which it appeared several times in St. Matthew. But this was one of the times. I don't know which one or where, and again, you'll hear the use of many weaving in and out inner parts, movement from note to note, against the soprano that, you know, pretty much does what it did for Kruger. So he's taken the alto, tenor, and bass from Kruger and just moved them around a little bit. So you'll hear that. by surprise myself again. I meant to mention this, but he had that one change. And the original was, let's find it here. Here, I'll just play out of the hymn book. That's a minor, and Bob changed it to, which is an interesting thing. He also changed the rhythm. So the phrases aren't what we expect. It's actually a little hard to play because I'm so used to phrasing it
the other way,
the way that we phrase it when we sing it, and that always catches me by surprise because I don't expect those rhythms. But it's a much more intricate version.
And we have the Kruger version in the hymnal, correct?
Yeah, we do. It's credited text Johann Hermann, translated Robert Bridges, and then music Johann Kruger is actually how it's designated.
And that's why that one feels so much better.
So these are the right people got to touch it at the right time.
Yeah.
People like Bach, and Bach wasn't the only one. There were others that had versions of it, and in their major works, major religious works, in all the centuries, even into the 20th century, there were people like Max Reger writing, using it in his works too. So it's still something that composers look at, especially if they're writing something for Easter week.
As you did.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
So again, it's a big part of the prelude that you wrote.
Yes, and it appears in my prelude, I think, week 3 of Lent, as Pastor Jeff's story evolves. His story that he gave me, how he wanted the prelude to set up the service. And so in week 1 and 2, we don't have a Holy Jesus, I don't think. I think it comes in week 3.
With the violin, correct?
I'm not sure.
I think the
violin.
violin.
I wrote it and arranged it, but I have to go back and look at it
I know.
myself.
I believe the violin comes in with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's very beautifully put together. So again, for our listeners, I hope that as you hear O Sacred Head and then hear A Holy Jesus in this music, that you will think about the differences, at least our interpretation of the differences. You may interpret it any way you like, but of those two pieces and how they fit into Holy Week and our Lenten worship. So,
and I'll just put a plug in for our, the Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday services, and of course Good Friday uses All Holy Jesus is usually the hymn of the day, or the hymn that we use to reflect on that Good Friday text, typically. And so, join us for those 2 services during Holy Week, as well as our Sunday online Lenten services that are currently going on. And we will probably talk about one more of the hymns of Lent that we're using. In fact, I'll give it away. I think we're going to talk about Amazing Grace next time, which is a pretty well-known story.
It is, I was going to say. People probably know more about that hymn than lots of hymns, but you never know. We might find some little nugget of interest.
We might. I'm sure we will. So join us again on the Music Chat. We'll see you then.
Bye.